Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday here at Treadwell. I'm Edward Titley, and today I'll be taking you through a discussion on AS1428.1. Now, before we start, a little bit of homework. If you've joined us before, you'll be familiar with this. If you haven't, welcome and thanks for joining. But a couple of things to think about. Firstly, everything we discussed today is general in nature. It's not site-specific advice. You shouldn't rely on it to determine compliance or non-compliance or anything like that. And secondly, we're not Standards Australia, so I can't tell you what they meant when they wrote the standard or anything like that. All we can do is look at what the standard says and how that might apply with the sort of work that we do here at Treadwell, um, public access, boardwalks, back of house maintenance type things. So it's not by any stretch a full discussion on the standard. We haven't got time for that. And it's quite frankly probably well beyond my pay grade, but have a bit of a look at about how the standards apply to the sort of work we do here. So without any further ado, we'll get going. We'll have a live Q&A session at the end, but I do have the Q&A window open, so feel free to put any questions in the chat, in the Q&A chat as you think of them, and we'll answer them as we go if we can, or we'll try and address them at the end if we can, or we'll take on notice and discuss further if that's what we need to do. So a bit of a summary of what's in AS 1428.1 2021, and that's an update in 2021 from the previous edition, which don't quote me, but I think it was 2009. So design requirements for new building work to enable equitable and dignified access for people with disabilities. So circulation spaces, signage requirements, ramps and walkways, stairs and handrails, doorways and corridors, and sanitary facilities. Now, obviously, some of these are not part of our sort of scope of work, so we're not going to address them specifically, but just so we're all clear as to what the standard covers. So we'll go through now and overview certain sections of the standard. I'm not going to read out the diagrams or anything like that to you, but it will just draw your attention to some things that we commonly see overlooked or things that come unstuck when we're trying to build, say, a boardwalk or a ramp or something like that in FRP, but to be in compliance to AS 1428.1. So circulation space is number one. So this section defines the minimum widths and turning circles necessary for wheelchair users to move freely, and also that the pathway or pathways are wide enough to allow two wheelchairs to pass comfortably and that a 180-degree turn is able to be done. So this is, if you like, a section view of a walkway. So what we need to see here is that firstly, 1980 minimum height at doorways or clearance. So we need to ensure that our signage, for example, is above that height. We've got a few obstacles here, shelves, fire hose reels, services cabinets, that sort of thing, which can encroach on our permissible area. And then our circulation space, 1,000 millimeters minimum width and 2,000 millimeters minimum height. Also draw your attention to the skirting is not the right term, but here having the radius of 15 as a maximum here. And note that the skirting obviously takes away from the circulation space, so we need to consider that, or we need to consider the internal dimensions when we're looking to comply with the circulation space requirements, being 1,000 mil minimum width and 2,000 mil height, except the doorways where the minimum height is 1980 millimeters. Next is a critical one that we often see overlooked on shared paths, walkways, those sort of things. Now, in a lot of instances, we don't want to have an 1800 mil wide walkway or a 2 meter wide walkway for the full extent of a pathway. That could be due to the expected traffic. That could be due to not wanting to encroach on the natural environment there. We don't want to build a structure that's wider than necessary. However, if we want something compliant to AS 1428.1, we need to ensure there's sufficient passing space for wheelchairs to allow two persons on wheelchairs to pass one another. So this here draws our attention to how we might do that. There's two ways here. So we have a minimum width of 1 metre um, for our pathway, and need to note that that needs to be a clear width, as we mentioned earlier. So things like curb rails or kick rails or handrail or services cabinets or anything that might encroach on that we need to consider. And then there's two ways we can provide a passing space. So one is simply increasing the width by 400 mil on each side to give us an overall width of 1800 mil, with a minimum length of 2000 millimeters. So that passing space needs to be 2 meters long. And the way we transition this increased width over a length of 400 mil, as you can see here on the lower diagram. Now, this upper diagram is another way to do it, and that is where we increase on one side only by 800 millimeters. Once again, we have an angled transition here, 400 mil coming out, 400 millimeters over a length of 400 millimeters, as you can see here. Very important to consider this, because if we don't, then it's very difficult for someone using a wheelchair, or impossible, quite potentially, to pass someone else on a shared path or boardwalk or walkway. Now, next part is ramp design requirements. Sometimes we see this not considered when we're designing a boardwalk or a ramp or a walkway. And as we'd all know, once we've built something, once we've started, if we're doing earthworks, something like that, much more difficult to give ourselves the real estate to incorporate something like this. So some general design requirements. Firstly, maximum gradient 1 in 14 for longer ramps. We should all be familiar with that. For the sake of brevity, we haven't included every single part of the standard here. Maximum cross slope 1 in 50. Minimum length of landing 1500 millimeters. And handrail requirements, we've addressed those on a different session, so we won't look at that today. If anyone would like us to do it again, please note that in the chat, and we'd be happy to add it to the schedule. There's several approaches we can have here, ramps and landings. So we can see here that I'm not sure I can explain all these verbally, but I'm sure you're well capable of seeing them on the screen. Approaches between our landing and the ramp by way of handrail and the actual path and so on. So we can approach on an angle, we can approach straight, or we can approach by manner of a curved ramp. A couple of things I'll draw your attention to here on the third diagram, so the curved approach. Firstly, we need a 600 mil straight ramp as we enter the landing. And secondly, the center line of the ramp is to be at 90 degrees to the landing for 600 mil. So that brings about, as a necessity, the curved approach. The 600 mil straight ramp that we see there, but something to think about. And also, in all these instances, we're seeing here that the ramp is to be at 90 degrees to the landing, or you can see here where we're coming in on an angled approach, this 90-degree requirement that where the ramp abuts or transitions into the landing, we need to have a straight entry, if you like, or at 90 degrees to the direction of the travel. Not sure if that makes sense. Difficult to explain in words, but I'm sure you can see what we're saying there. Now, ramp handrail layouts. This is another thing that, once again, is often overlooked, sometimes overlooked, and a lot more difficult to rectify afterwards. So, handrails shall extend a minimum of 300 millimeters horizontally past the transition point at the top and bottom of the ramp, except where the inner handrail is continuous at an intermediate landing. So here we can see, we demonstrate here our 1000 mil inside width again. We have our demonstration here of our transitions between landings with our maximum gradient of our, shall I say, intermediate walkway at 1 in 20. 1200 mil landing where we transition from the walkway to the ramp, ramp at 1 in 14, another 1200 mil landing, 1 in 14 ramp, and then another, and so on and so forth with our ramp and then landings at minimum 1200 mil. So this is a plan view on the top. Elevation view as the second diagram, you can see what this looks like. In fact, we're extending our handrail 300 mil from the location of transition, so where we go from a landing to a ramp, and the handrail either has a turn through 180 degrees, or we return fully to the end post or the face of the wall, depending on what that looks like. Also, between 865 and 1,000 millimeters, we need to consider that. And once again, we're drawing your attention to the maximum gradient of the ramp being 1 in 14, as opposed to the maximum gradient for the walkway 1 in 20, but then the requirement here for the intermediate landings. Now, just a note further on handrail, the handrails must run continuously along the length of the ramp or stair. Yes, that's reasonably obvious. But also, a minimum clearance of 50 mil must be maintained between the handrail and any adjacent wall or other surface. So we need to consider if we're running along on one side against, say, a seawall or something like that, need to ensure that we're installing a handrail such to provide this minimum clearance of 50 mil. Bit of an example there of a ramp you can see here, full FRP structure, handrail system here, compliant with the handrail height of AS1428.1. So you can see this intermediate rail, if you can see the screen, a variety of transitions and landings there. Now, we've probably potentially covered some of this, but this is what we call a step ramp. We've mentioned that the length of landings must be not less than 1200 mil in the direction of travel. However, where there's a change of direction, not exceeding 90 degrees, then the length of your landing should be a minimum of 1500 mil. So you can see, hopefully it's large enough on your screen to demonstrate that if we're continuing in the same direction, 1200 mil flat landing. However, if we're changing direction here by 90 degrees, then the dimensions of this landing are to be 1500 millimeters. Curb ramp design requirements, not something we really get involved in with what we supply, but something I'll just draw your attention to. Length of landings at curb ramp should be not less than 1200 mil in the direction of travel. However, where we've got a T-junction, the landing should be a minimum of 1500 by 2000 millimeters. Where there's a single change of direction, then the landing should be minimum 1500 by 1500. So you can see here, several views, a plan view here where we can travel in both directions here, and the way this is to be done. I won't read out all this to everyone. I'll just draw your attention to it. This would often need to be considered if we're bringing in where we'd often see this, if we have a T-junction, if we've got a boardwalk continuing through or an elevated walkway or ramp, and we need to bring a transition to an area that's slightly lower only than the walking surface, then we need to consider a curb ramp type design. On stairways now, construction of stairways, a couple of things to consider. Firstly, we need a 900 mil setback where stairs meet property boundaries. So if we see our property boundary here, then we need a setback of 900 mil from the edge of the property line to the first stair riser. Now, secondly, where we've got TGSIs or tactiles, we need to have one tread width from the edge of the tactile to the first riser. You can see that here. We've noted our handrail once again, where we continue parallel to the flat surface, so not the stairs, for 300 mil, and now turn 180 degrees or return to the end post or wall face And then we need to have one tread width of handrail where we can see the transition start to the angle of the stairs before that first riser once again. And also, we're having our height here, 865 to 1000 mil from the top, from our front, the nose of the tread, if you like, and same idea at the top, the 300 mil minimum straight transition, and then we see the TGSI installed there as well. Handrail designs for stairs. Once again, this is not something we come across really a lot here. I'm sorry, we're nearly done. We are running a little bit over time, so I'll try and keep it brief. Handrail should be continuous throughout the flight of stairs and where practicable around landings, and no obstruction on or above the handrail up to a height of 600 mil. So you can see here handrails are required on both lateral sides. Handrails must maintain the nosing angle. And as we've mentioned before, the handrail should extend beyond the last riser by one tread depth, which is so parallel to the angle of the stairs, if you like, and then 300 mil after that. So you can see here on diagram A, the section view, this handrail continuing parallel to the slope of the stairs by one tread width, and then we have our 300 mil transition. And likewise, where at the landing detail B, we have one tread width parallel with the landing, where we're making that transition before we rotate around through 180 degrees to go up the next flight of stairs. And this is the last one, so thanks everyone for staying with us. Sorry, we're running a little over time. Nosings. Now, the nosing requirements of AS1428.1 are very specific, and we can see this overlooked where someone's just acquiring, say, tread material, and we're not clear as to where it's going because the requirements of 1428.1 are different to other standards. AS1657 doesn't have requirements like this. There's some requirements, but they're not stringent. But then AS1428.2 and some other standards also have different requirements. So it's important to be clear when you're ordering, and I just bring this up when you're detailing, when you're ordering, that we don't just see FRP stair tread or something like that. We actually see a specific detail around the nosing requirements. So we'll just talk to these briefly. Firstly, our risers to be opaque. That may mean there's an infill plate required. That can be done in FRP. 15 mil max setback from the front of the tread. We would typically make that 0, so there's no setback. One contrasting color strip between 50 and 75 mil max. And then the thing is cut off a little here, but I also draw your attention to the something that's might have been cut off in this diagram. But the drop down the front of the tread can be no more than 10 millimeters, so 0 to 10. 5 mil maximum radius on the front lip of the nosing, and not typically applicable for FRP treads because we typically do those square, but maximum splay of our riser is 25 mil. I think that's about it. That's the end of this presentation. I hope it was of some value. It's difficult to distill down the pertinent points of standards into a sort of 15-20 minute session, but I hope it was of some value. So that's general advice, but happy to have further project-specific discussions if you'd like. It's 1:49 p.m. here in New South Wales. Stay on for a minute or two. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A chat. And we'd also also appreciate your contribution. There should be a poll that's come through. If you could just respond to those two questions there, any feedback, any topics you'd like us to review in the future, feel free to do that. And any feedback at all, good, bad, or ugly, if this is worthwhile, if it's a waste of time, etc. Feel free to say so. Any feedback is worthwhile. If there's sessions are not offering value, then we'd like to know that and either stop them or make them do that. In the meantime, you're welcome to have a chat to us. Hello@treadwellgroup.com.au. or give us a call 1-800-246-800 for Australia and 0800-244-600 for New Zealand. Question come up as to the interval for passing spaces in a walkway. Look, I'm sorry, I can't answer that right here, but if you could drop us an email, hello@treadwellgroup.com.au, I will just check the standard and get back to you on that. I'm sorry, I can't remember that detail off the top of my head. If you could drop us an email to hello@treadwellgroup.com.au, be happy to confirm that for you. If there's no more questions, we'll wrap it up. Thanks, Mark. Glad it was worthwhile and instructive for you, and yourself and anyone else listening. Please feel free to offer suggestions on what you'd like to see again. A lot of these topics are suggested by our regular attendees, so always looking for that feedback. Otherwise, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for joining another Tech Talk Tuesday, and have a good afternoon. And thanks, Chris. Glad it was worthwhile. And thanks, Dylan. Cheers.